What happens when a high-profile interview stops being polite and starts sounding like a political showdown? Tonight, we pull back the curtain on a conversation that turned into a confrontation, where questions about power, privacy, and the royal family collided with sharp defiance and unapologetic ambition. Was it confidence, or pure arrogance? One thing is certain: this was no ordinary celebrity sit-down. This was a televised battle for control of the narrative. It was billed as a conversation, not a confrontation. The lights dimmed, the audience held its breath, and two chairs faced each other in the familiar format of an American primetime interview. On one side sat Diane Sawyer, a figure known for her pointed questions and seasoned composure. On the other sat Meghan Markle, equally composed but carrying the unmistakable air of someone who arrived not to be interviewed, but to challenge. At first, the exchange carried the rhythm of courtesy, light pleasantries, an acknowledgement of history, and a nod toward the topics the world expected to hear. But almost immediately, the veneer began to crack. Diane's voice was steady, deliberate, as she probed. Many Americans feel you've been defined through the lens of others, by your marriage, by motherhood, by the monarchy. Who do you say Meghan Markle is? The question was not hostile, but the reply came back sharp, laced with defiance. Meghan leaned forward, eyes flashing. Defined by others? That's the problem right there. I'm not here to fit into categories. I don't need titles, I don't need labels. What I have is power, and I'm not afraid to show it. The atmosphere shifted instantly. This was no longer about soft reflections or nostalgia. This was about control, who owned the narrative, and who would shape the public perception. The tension wasn't hidden, it was televised, every pause magnified, every sharp word recorded for millions to dissect. Diane tried to maintain the guardrails of a journalist, redirecting, reframing, balancing, but the momentum was slipping. The interviewee had turned into an aggressor. In that moment, what had been promoted as an intimate sit-down began to feel like a political debate. Not about policy or party, but about image and identity. Meghan's tone was less that of a guest explaining herself and more that of a candidate defending a record under fire. Her sentences carried weight, sometimes veering into slogans: "I will not be diminished. I will not be silent. I am not a supporting character. I am the story." The audience, silent but perceptive, could sense the shift. Viewers at home, used to celebrity interviews packaged in gloss and grace, were instead watching a standoff. Two women, both experienced with the public eye, but locked now in a contest for dominance. And so, what began as dialogue morphed into duel. A sit-down interview became something closer to a trial, with every response framed as testimony, every question as cross-examination. By the end of this opening act, one truth was clear: this was not a conversation. It was the opening salvo of a televised showdown. By the time the second round of questions began, it was no longer an interview. It was a negotiation over identity. Diane Sawyer pressed with the kind of precision familiar to American audiences. Careful, measured, and undeniably firm. You speak of power, Meghan. Yet many Americans still wonder, do you embrace your roles as wife, as mother, as Duchess? Or do you reject them altogether? The question landed like a gavel. It was not an attack, but it cut to the heart of the contradiction that had followed Meghan since her first step into the royal spotlight. Meghan's reply was swift, her tone sharpened into steel. Why should a woman have to be defined by those titles? Why must I be reduced to who I married, or the children I raised, or the institution I walked away from? Those are fragments of me, but not the sum of me. I stand alone, independent, powerful. It was a declaration that echoed across the stage like a campaign speech, the kind of rhetoric that challenged not only the question but the very premise behind it. To some, it sounded liberating, a rejection of outdated molds. To others, it rang with hostility, as though dismissing roles that millions of women proudly carry. Diane adjusted her posture, refusing to yield ground. She responded not with confrontation, but with clarity, yet those roles are not insignificant. To many Americans, being a spouse, a parent, a public servant, these are not chains. They are commitments. They are responsibilities. Are you saying those roles diminish you? Meghan's eyes narrowed, her hands tightening on the armrest. What I'm saying is that I will not be confined. Too often, women are expected to apologize for ambition. Too often, confidence is mistaken for arrogance. I will not be boxed in by expectations that exist to control me. The audience, though unseen, could feel the friction. Two worldviews colliding under studio lights. What Diane framed as duty, Meghan reframed as limitation. What Diane called responsibility, Meghan called control. And so, the tension deepened. The conversation was no longer about titles or labels. It had become a referendum on how women in power should be seen, whether they must embrace traditional roles as badges of honor, or cast them aside in pursuit of self-determined freedom. The exchange carried the cadence of American political discourse, pointed, polarizing, and impossible to ignore. Viewers weren't just watching an interview, they were witnessing a clash over the meaning of identity itself. By the close of this chapter, it was clear, Meghan was not simply rejecting labels. She was rewriting the rules of how she wanted to be perceived. But in doing so, she ignited a new wave of questions, and Diane Sawyer was not about to let them pass unanswered. The tension in the studio was no longer subtle. It was electric. Diane Sawyer, seasoned in the art of hard questions, leaned forward with the calm persistence of a prosecutor laying out evidence. Her voice, measured but unwavering, carried a question that had followed Meghan across continents. You've spoken of wanting privacy. Yet you've signed multi-million-dollar deals, launched documentaries, and sat for interviews like this one. Can both things be true? The phrasing was deliberate. To the American viewer, it sounded like a charge, a contradiction exposed under the bright lights. Meghan's response was sharp, almost immediate. Privacy does not mean silence. It means choice. I choose what I share. I choose when to speak. No one has the right to demand access to me, and yet I have every right to use my voice on my terms. The statement hit with the cadence of a closing argument, part defense, part declaration. But Diane wasn't finished. She countered with precision. But doesn't power come with accountability? When you step into the spotlight, isn't there an obligation to answer for how you use it? The air grew heavier. Meghan's tone, once defensive, now turned combative. Accountability? Where was accountability when I was targeted, when my family was hounded, when lies were printed as headlines? You speak of responsibility. What about responsibility to truth? To fairness? I will not apologize for reclaiming the narrative that others tried to steal from me. To viewers, the moment resembled a congressional hearing more than a celebrity interview. One side demanded consistency, the other demanded recognition of injustice. It was less about Hollywood, more about power itself, how it's claimed, how it's used, and how it's judged. Diane pressed again, her voice carrying the authority of the public she represented. But many Americans believe power and privacy cannot coexist. If you want influence, doesn't that mean giving something back? Transparency, humility, respect for the public eye? Meghan's retort was unyielding. That belief is the trap. It's the double standard. Men in power are allowed to draw boundaries. Women in power are punished for it. I will not be punished for knowing my worth. The clash crystallized into something larger than an interview. It was no longer just Diane and Meghan. It was a debate millions of viewers understood in their own lives. Privacy versus publicity. Influence versus accountability. Confidence versus perceived arrogance. By the end of this chapter, the audience was left divided but captivated. Meghan had defended her right to control her story, but Diane had exposed the contradictions that refused to go away. The studio lights flickered not with warmth, but with the unmistakable glow of a battle unresolved. By the fourth exchange, the stage no longer resembled a studio. It had transformed into something closer to a political chamber, with the royal family standing as the unspoken subject on trial. Diane Sawyer, her voice sharpened with precision, drew the line clearly. You've described the monarchy as a cage. Yet it also gave you global visibility, a platform few could imagine. Was it only a burden, or also a benefit? The question echoed like emotion on the Senate floor, pointed, layered, demanding an answer beyond emotion. Meghan's eyes narrowed, her voice steady but edged with fire. A gilded cage is still a cage. Visibility without freedom is not opportunity, it's exploitation. I was paraded, dissected, and dismissed. That is not empowerment. That is control. Her words fell with the weight of indictment. She was no longer speaking merely of personal experience. She was framing the monarchy itself as an outdated system of power. To some in the audience, it sounded like truth long overdue. To others, it sounded like rejection of duty, of tradition, of gratitude. Diane leaned in, unflinching. But critics argue that you benefited from that very system. The titles, the ceremonies, the global attention. These weren't chains. How do you reconcile condemning what also amplified your voice? The silence stretched, heavy as a courtroom pause. Then Meghan answered with the cadence of a closing argument. If a system elevates you while breaking you, does that make it just? If it gives you a microphone while silencing your truth, is that freedom? I walked away because no platform is worth the price of losing yourself. The words struck like a political manifesto, part rebellion, part declaration of independence. It was not just about her story. It was about dismantling an institution she cast as relic, a monarchy she portrayed as incompatible with modern values. Yet Diane refused to yield the ground. And yet millions still respect that institution. Some see it as stability, tradition, even service. Are you dismissing all of that? Meghan's answer came sharp, unapologetic. Tradition without humanity is theatre. Stability without compassion is illusion. If an institution cannot evolve, it does not deserve reverence, it deserves reform. The clash was unmistakable. To viewers, it felt less like a celebrity interview and more like a televised debate over monarchy itself, with Meghan as the insurgent voice and Diane as the steady representative of public skepticism. By the end of this chapter, one truth had crystallized. The royal family was no longer just Meghan's past. In this studio, it had become the battlefield for ideas about power, privilege, and the cost of belonging to an institution that demanded loyalty of campaign rhetoric, designed not only to defend but to redefine. Yet Diane was relentless, the voice of the skeptical public that watched with crossed arms. But self-assurance, survival may explain it. But leadership demands humility. Without it, confidence risks becoming arrogance. Don't you see that risk? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Meghan's silence was not surrender. It was strategy, independence and isolation, power and responsibility. And as millions of viewers debated in their living rooms, one truth remained. This was not just an interview. It was a referendum on how America judges women who refuse to bend, and the costs that come with standing